let's start then. So thank you very much, Shane, and also Steve for being there. So as you know, I've been writing a custom SFDX CLI for a long time now, and well, as a bad practice, I didn't write a lot of tests for it for several reasons. First, well, I'm not really used to JavaScript testing first, even less for custom CLI plugins, and so I don't know how to simulate like a call or whatever. So I just never did it, and I thought if I can't find any information, maybe I'm not the only one, and that's why I asked for help, and thankfully you came to help me and maybe all the community. So I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit deeper and start your presentation. Thank you very much for being here.
All right, thanks for having us. And it still blows my mind every now and then, being 42 years old, and I think that I'm giving a presentation in real time to someone who's like 8,000 kilometers away, and you know, every now and then I have to just stop and pause and appreciate that fact. Yeah, so my name is Shane McLaughlin. I am in Texas, so I live outside of Houston, and I also brought Steve Hetzel with me today because some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about for testing plugins all relates to things that he's written several times over the years, and we've kind of packaged it up and made some of it public now. And so he's going to show you a lot of that kind of stuff after we get through kind of the first part of our topic. So yeah, so my name's Shane. I've been a developer on the Salesforce platform for a little over 10 years and at Salesforce for almost 7. And I currently work on the CLI team. I used to build a plugin before I was on this team that was sort of kind of what Fabian was doing, which was like standing from the outside, looking in and trying to figure out how to do all this stuff. And so I was doing a lot of testing very different than how the CLI team does testing. And so we'll talk about some of the historical stuff there. And Steve, you want to introduce yourself too?
Yeah, hi, I'm Steve Hetzel. I am based out of the Denver, Colorado office. Been with Salesforce for almost 5 years, most of that time on the Salesforce CLI team. I spent a little bit of time on the Idea Exchange, the recently reimagined Idea Exchange team, and then I came back to the CLI team. That's me.
Cool. So agenda-wise today, we're going to have two main topics. The first one is how to start a plugin, and inside there's several options, and we'll talk about why you might choose one versus the other, and look through some of the code as to what those options give you, so that you're not starting from 0, but you might start from 50, or you might start from 1,000, and 1,000 might be overkill. So we'll talk about those, and then after that we'll move into the very large topic that Fabian mentioned of testing. And we'll start with unit tests and kind of show some of the unit tests that we do and how they work, some of the limitations and stuff that we've run into. And then we're going to talk about not unit testing, which Steve is going to go into the framework that we've just released for that. And then we'll show some examples of how those things work. And then at the end of all this, we'll bring it together and show you some of our CI examples of how we test our plugins with the unit tests and the not unit tests. And then how we sort of do like post-release testing and some of that kind of stuff, because you may be thinking in that direction for some of your plugins. And then if we have time, also want to do a little bit of like, well, how would you use these tests for some debugging scenarios, in terms of like, oh, yeah, I need to run some stuff from the test and see why what the test is doing is why it's doing what it's doing. So I'm going to start with the topic of getting plugins started. And I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to be mostly looking at code. Steve has got a really nice set of presentations around TestKit. And so until we get to that, you're just going to have to deal with my screen. All right. So the first thing that we have is this repo that's the SFDX plugin generate. And you'll see that this one, if we look in the source, actually, I ran this not too long ago, so maybe we can go over to the terminal. And, I have one for you. And what I did was I ran this command that says SFDX plugin generate, and then you can give your plugin a name. So I just call it Paris plugin. And we're going to look through the code that's here, starting with the stuff that's in the source. So what the generator does is it generates a really simple hello world example. But in this case, we've called it hello org. And it includes some of the stuff that's really, really common use cases for CLI plugins, where you actually want to connect to an org or maybe a developer hub and be able to ask those orgs questions. And so if I think about all the plugins that I've written, I would say 90% of them are doing some sort of REST API operation on an org. And so this is an example of using the query that you can see right here. This is just a basic SQL query. We're running it against the org, but you can already see there's some things that the plugin gives you, which is, I just want to say, oh, give me a connection to the org. And it could be your default org. It could be because you passed in a username or something like that. So all that kind of stuff is done for you. And then you can get down to the logic of, oh, I need to query some records, or I need to do an update or post a record if I want to create something. And then there's also some examples of, putting together some output, parsing the results that come back from this. And then there's also this little UX framework that's here that's like, this is how we output stuff to the terminal, whether I want to log it or display some JSON or make a table. There's a whole bunch of stuff here in this UX library. So if I wanted to say table, or I want to have those nice little spinners. So all these things are here for you to start with. And it'll give you a decent idea of how to deal with some of the stuff that you have to deal with. For example, parsing flags. So I need to get the name. I need to get some property. The other thing it does is it sets you up with these messages, which we store in a separate folder, so that if you wanted to edit these messages, you can kind of edit it, but not have to be in the code. And if you maybe have different people doing these different parts of it, that's how that works. So really basic command. And then we're going to talk a lot about testing, but we give you a really simple unit test that helps you with some of the things that are built in automatically. So, for example, you want to make a connection, but you want to mock what comes back for unit testing purposes. You want to parse the output, and then you want to expect it to say something in particular related to the data that came back. So this is sort of the fastest way to get set up with a simple command that does connect to an org and do some operations, as well as a unit test that can run for that. And if we go to the package JSON, you will kind of get an idea of what's in here. So we're using some of our libraries. You'll also see some dependencies that we have. So for example, Mocha, Chai for assertions, test code coverage, TS node. But this is a fairly simple bunch of stuff. And then we have some scripts down here. And so you can see that we're doing some linting. We have some generating your README files. So these things make a really nice little README file once you run them. It'll give you like all the help text output that would show up if you say --help on this command that you create. And it also walks you through how to get started on it. And so if you look at some of the other stuff in here, what you won't see are really sophisticated linting rules. There's like some really basic old TS-lint stuff and some configuration. And so this is sort of our least opinionated plugin. This is, I want to get something started and I want to use it. And I really don't want to have a whole bunch of overhead associated with it. And we rarely use this one because we have a whole bunch of other things that we like to do. And for that, there are two other templates. So let's see, template. All right. So this is the primary template if you're writing a plugin. And if I were to open up the code here, you would see it actually has the exact same command and the exact same test in it. And so the code itself and what it does is completely identical to what you just saw. But you'll start to see a whole bunch of additional files. And if we go look at the package JSON, you can see there's a lot more going on. And so this is the template that we would use if we were starting a new plugin. So Steve is right now working on a rewrite of the source commands like source convert and source deploy and that type of stuff, source retrieve. And there's a whole new plugin that's not available yet for that. And it's based off of this template. And if you go look at the scripts in particular, you'll see some really bizarre things that you don't normally see, which is SF-something. And so what we've done here is standardize all of these repos, because if you were to go look at our status repo, you would see that we're starting to have quite a big number of these. So this is the alias commands and the auth commands and the config commands and custom metadata commands, the data commands, the org commands, etc. And so what we wanted to do with this is have this template that keeps things consistent, but also consistent over time. And so we have, for example, in some of the dev dependencies, we have this thing called dev config and dev scripts. And when you run those, they're going to ensure some minimum versions of things. And so, for example, if I were to run it, but I had Mocha 6, it's going to help me get that up to date. And so as we update those, we kind of keep all the plugins in line and consistent. The same thing with all these scripts. And so if I look at, for example, the lint script, this is actually a script that lives in this dev package, so that every repo we have is all using the exact same test script and the exact same lint script and the exact same build script. And then you'll see some other things that we have here as well. And I'm going to flip over to a repo and I'll show you kind of what this looks like. Oh. As soon as I find VS Code. Okay, here we go. And so if I run this test command that we saw in our SF test, so I'm going to say yarn test, and it's going to run this test script. And as a user, you may think, oh, this is probably going to run all my unit tests, and that would be correct. But you can see it's also doing some compiling of the test directory, and it's also running NYC for test code coverage. And so all the repos are going to do this the same way. So, Mocha unit tests, as you would expect. But then you also get the test code coverage that's coming from the Istanbul. And then you'll see a couple of extra commands that are run that you probably wouldn't expect to see running. So we have these two commands here for the test deprecation policy and the command reference. And what they're doing is looking at your snapshots, which is the output of generating the command reference and looking at all the flags and stuff. So what this would say if I went and changed something. So for example, if I went to the password generate command and decided to modify one of the flags here. So let's say I decided to change the name of the on behalf of flag. Okay, and as a plugin owner, you probably could do this if you wanted to. If this were a Salesforce plugin, we would get in trouble for that. Everyone would fuss and say, hey, you broke my scripts, and your code is not backward compatible and all that. So basically, we're checking that any plugin author is making sure that they don't accidentally break things, and that they follow the deprecation policy of giving warnings and waiting at least one release before they make big changes to their commands. So that's kind of some examples of some of the things that are running in here that are, I guess, extremely opinionated, maybe too opinionated as to what versions of things you use and what changes you can make and deprecate and stuff like that. We also have some, what I call them, conventional commits. And if I hadn't worked with these before coming to this team, but if I were to be in this repo and I wanted to say git commit -m blah, this would throw an error because we actually want you to classify what your commits are. So for example, if I said, oh, this is a new feature, then all of our automation would know that we need to release a new minor version of something. And this might generate a patch release, right? But if I just said, oh, this is, I'm upgrading some dependency or something like that, this might not even generate a release because we're tracking these, they generate the change logs. They do a lot of really nice automated things for you. And so if I just said, for example, today's topic, let's say I was adding some unit test coverage, we wouldn't have to do a new release for that. We would just add it to the code base and run it from there. So there's little enforced things that you may find extraordinarily inconvenient. The last piece that's probably of interest here is some of our stuff that we've kind of put on here. So you probably don't want to send your bugs here. Things you might not want to use. For example, we have a rule that says in our ESLint stuff, if you don't have this little copyright header, then it's going to throw an error. And Fabian's plugin, he probably doesn't want to assign the copyright to Salesforce. And so like this would be something that you might want to take out of this template. But for us, it is useful. For people outside of Salesforce, you may have to make you may have to remove a few things versus starting with the plugin generator and then adding a whole bunch of things. The other thing that's useful, that's important to know, is that these are running on all of our existing plugins. And so, for example, we were looking at plugin user when we ran our tests. But this is one where we've received pull requests from some of our users, including Fabian, I believe. And when we QA these things, if you ever decide to contribute to some of the plugins, you may be interacting with some of these scripts where it's checking various things. And if you try to commit something with the wrong commit message and all that kind of stuff. So that's why it's at least useful to know, how these things work and what they do. And then the last one I want to show besides the plugin template is this one. And it looks a little bit different. If you've worked with Lerna before, it's for running several node packages within the same project. And so, for example, when you scroll down, you'll see that it has a plugin. And if we go into this code, it'll look like you would, not like that. It doesn't work until we actually generate a template, generate it from the template. We'll do it the easy way. So when we go in here, you'll see it has a package JSON and it looks pretty much like your plugins usually work. But it also lets you have inside packages, for example, a library. And we do this sometimes where you have a lot of logic that you may want to use outside of your plugin. So you write the library and it can export some things. And then maybe you write a VS Code extension that uses the library, or you have one plugin that's using it, but you also have some, for example, server-side Node.js project that also wants to use the same stuff without having to go through the plugin. It can go directly to the library. So the plugin becomes a really skinny wrapper, and most of the logic and commands and all that kind of stuff is living in the library. So if you think you might ever want to use your work outside of your own plugin, then this may be a better way to start that. All right, so that is 3 ways to start a plugin, from really simple and unopinionated to not simple and probably over opinionated for a third party outside of the Salesforce company. I'm going to pause here for questions before we move on to some of the testing topics.
So any question, if you're shy, you can write them. I can say them out loud with my wonderful English accent.
Will you provide a config without all the Salesforce specific tooling like the copyright header and stuff like that, so that really end users can take profit from that?
We have not done that yet. It might be better just to add that to the README in terms of like what would you take out, or what's too Salesforce specific, rather than trying to manage another template that's like slightly different. Yeah, I didn't really show it, but some of the other stuff that's good in there is like all of our ESLint rules that we use for plugins, and like the prettier config, and some of the things that you would normally have to configure for JavaScript and TypeScript and that kind of stuff. Yeah, let me make a note of that. I'll have to find out what's the easiest way to do that. If I were doing it the easy way, if you look in the package.json, you'll see they're all the dev dependencies that are expressed there. So if I wanted to get rid of, for example, the Salesforce license, that's just an ESLint rule that's running. So I could, say yarn remove ESLint-config-salesforce-license, and it would get rid of that. And if you're not using the header, you could probably get rid of that too. But you might like the rest of the ESLint rules. So yeah, that'd probably be the easiest way to do it. And that should probably be in the instructions. Good question. Good question.
I think we have another question from John Daniel in the chat. He's asking, have you tried to upgrade your earlier developed plugins to this new opinionated template? If so, any advice, lessons learned, issues?
The answer to that one is no. And the reason is because this job has kept me really busy. When you get a new job and you're really busy learning all the stuff that you have no idea about. It is on my list of things I would like to do. And yeah, so I don't have any advice for that yet.
Can I ask a follow-up real quick? I mean, basically where I'm going is it, I know Fabian's plugin has got some life on it. I've got a couple of plugins that's got some life on it. I know you've got some plugins out there that have been developed a couple of years ago and stuff like that. It sounds like it might be just simpler just to try to generate a new template and sort of reinvent the plugin as opposed to updating and upselling it. So that's really where this question is thinking.
Yeah, we have taken really old code. And this is what I've been doing with a bunch of my spare time, is taking really old code out of the current CLI and moving it to plugins. And that's been an interesting journey, because the older the code is, the harder it is to get up to our current TypeScript standards, for example. And so you'll find stuff that you used to not quite put good typing on, and now that's an issue. So yeah, it's going to be a lot easier for third-party plugins because they're much more recent than some of our old code. But yeah, I should probably take a personal day at some point and do that just for fun and just kind of see what the experience is. I think if I were doing it, I would probably copy most of the dependencies from this template that we have, rather than start specifically with the template. Because by the time you yarn install all of these, or yarn add all of these things, you'll be pretty close to what we're doing. And that way, for example, you could incrementally add them to match this. Be like, okay, good, I satisfied all the prettier rules, and that's one big commit, and then add the next one. I think is how I would do it.
I think we also have a very good question from Kier Boden. It's do you foresee a plugin exchange with third-party security reviewed signed plugins anytime soon?
Okay, so I'm not the PM, and the biggest problem there is security, because things that run on the App Exchange, they're installing in a Salesforce org, and like the Salesforce orgs have a lot of built-in security around callouts, and you kind of have to allow what's going to happen and endpoints and all that kind of stuff. Whereas once we install something on your machine, that's a much scarier type of thing for a third party that, even if they mean well, but they've someone's hacked their npm and manages to release something as an upgrade to their plugin. There's a lot of security stuff that we have not thought through on that. And so like right now, we sort of put the burden on the user to say, yes, I accept this and I want to install this third-party plugin. But even if we did the security review, I'm not sure Salesforce security could get to the point where it's ever 100% comfortable given the power of like local installed executable plugin type stuff. So I think we may end up with something that's like an easier way to discover third-party plugins, and maybe a way for third parties to sign their plugins. For example, they could say, oh, this is the Accenture plugin, and we as Accenture are signing it, and you can tell it really is Accenture plugins. So if you trust those, then you would trust this. But yeah, I don't see an easy path to getting there. And it's not a technical problem, I guess is probably the best description. And then also, like, I have no business making that comment. That'd probably be the last thing I'd add to it.
I think it was the last question for now.
Okay, cool. Well, we're going to start with unit tests next. And you saw a quick run of this as part of our section on templates and scripts. But these are all just Mocha stuff. And this is pretty close to what you would get if we started from the plugin generator or from any of those templates. I'm going to walk you through. This is the command. This is force user password generate, and I want to kind of walk through some of the stuff that we've added to this to help understand how we do unit testing. So one of the first things you'll see is we've got some of these things that are part of our command library. And so this is for the mocking, and we'll use this a few places in here. We're importing a whole bunch of stuff from Salesforce core. And if you're not familiar with this, most of our plugins that deal with users and orgs and authorizations and that kind of stuff are all using this core library that's here at SFDX core. And it's not super big, but you can see it has a lot of these really common things like connections and auth info and some of the how we get tokens in and out of the encrypted state. And so anytime you start to write tests for unit tests, you end up at least connecting to this library for orgs and connections, and then maybe users and some other things. And so, for example, when we do this user password generate, we're going to come down here real quick, and you can't really generate a password without doing something to the org. And so we have this little set that says prepare stubs. And if we come up to wherever our prepare stubs is, you can start to see we start using this auth info class that came in from core. And then the only thing we really want it to do is we just need this one method off of it to return some sample data. And that sample data is here in our auth fields. And so we have, it's going to come back with, this is the org ID, this is the username, like that type of basic stuff. But the class is actually quite a bit bigger. Auth info is a very large class that has a lot of methods, and they use each other and stuff like that. So there's this little thing called stub interface, which is going to stub out everything it needs to qualify as an auth info in order to like satisfy that type definition. And then we can modify only the parts that we actually need to use for our test. And so if we needed some other method off of auth info, we could then put a comma and return something else for another method. And then you start to see all the stuff that we end up mocking just to do a user password, because, oh, well, we need an org, and the org needs to be able to return a username. But oh, we also need the API version, because by the way, password setting changed between version 50 and version 51. And then we need a connection because we're going to have to go update that in the org. But we also need to sometimes query for users and stuff like that. So for example, this is our query where we need to get the user ID. So you give me a username, I have to go ask the org to get a user ID back so that we can set the password for that user ID, because that's how the API works. So you start to see all the stuff that we end up mocking. And then when we come down, if you want to, for example, have some exception handling that you want to run your unit test through, then you can also say, well, I want a throws condition so that now I can be like, okay, throw the error and I want to handle this error. Or I want to actually pretend like it came back successfully. Or, this is an example of, I want to stub a method, and if you pass in this argument, I want to give you back this result. And, these types of things, you could also say some other, and then I could give you back some other answer. So it's sort of like we could play a lot of options there to get through the different paths of your plugin. So for example, one might be a good username, one might be a bad username, those types of things. And so almost all the tests will usually start off with some sort of mocks and stubs type of setup. And then once you've got that ready, this is the actual test itself. And so this is a framework called Fancy Test. And I don't know, it is not ours, it's somebody else's. And then on top of that, Oak Cliff added some features on top of Fancy Test. And so when you pull in test here, you're sort of getting the Oak Cliff flavored Fancy Test. And it does make it somewhat simple. So you can say, okay, do the stubbing, and then we want to capture the standard out. And then this is the command we want to run. So this is password generate on behalf of some test users. And then we have the actual assertions. So this is what we expect the JSON to return. And then the, verify that we're calling the right stuff and that the expected value is what we expected. And then you can see, I think there's 3 tests in here that kind of do very similar things. And that is the unit test for this. Your tests are probably going to look a lot like this if you're trying to stub out orgs and connections. And so I would say plugin user is a pretty decent place to steal code from in terms of like, oh, how do I take one of these? How do I take one of these? And so what's being used here is CNOD. That's my French for the day. So if not, this is all of these little types that we've added to our test library. And that is designed to keep all these things running really fast. And so if you look down to our test output, a lot of these things are running in milliseconds, and the entire test suite is a second to run, outside of like compiling code coverage and some of the like scripts that happen as part of that test run. But the actual running of the Mocha unit tests for the 5 commands that are in here is all like super fast. And so it's easy as a developer to verify this kind of stuff. The other thing that's useful is we are validating the JSON output. So if you were to ever make a change, or one of you were to contribute something to plugin user that changed the JSON output, that would be really bad for all the other CLI users. And we would want to know right away that that's changing, and figure out the right way to either deprecate something or give people lots of notice that we're about to change it, or find a way that the change doesn't impact existing users. So it's like additive to it rather than like removing some property or renaming something. So that's a little bit about unit tests and how those run. The limitations to the usefulness on this are pretty much around all of these mocks. So they're nice because they work really fast. The downside is we have mocked out pretty much all of this stuff from core. And so a couple scenarios happen. You have, we could change something in SFDX core, and the mocks are still mocking and saying whatever you wanted them to say. And so we don't recognize those breaks. The other thing you see is they're really dependent on the org. And so sometimes Salesforce changes APIs across major versions, and we don't know about it on the CLI team, and we don't catch one of these changes. So that happens. The other thing we get is we have different commands that are interacting on the same files. So for example, we have these auth files where we store auth tokens and usernames and passwords and all that kind of stuff. And if some other command is writing to those and it changes the what's expected there, then it becomes one of those things where someone's change broke someone else's plugin. And we won't know that by running these. And so that's why we also have been adding this year a lot more emphasis on integration testing, because there's so much stuff going on outside of this particular plugin that we're mocking that it becomes hard to catch those things in practice. And so I'm going to pass this over to Steve, who's going to talk about tests that are not unit tests and this little thing that we've built this year. All right, how do I make Steve the presenter? I'm going to stop sharing.
Maybe I need to do it. Let's see.
Okay.
Or not.
Okay, I'm having to choose between lots of different options here. Google Chrome. Let's see what happens when I do this. Sorry. Can you see, am I sharing anything?
No, I don't know if, because I can't see the option to move you as a presenter.
Not yet, I think.
I don't know.
Okay, maybe I have to do it.
Maybe I gave you all my superpower, Shane, and I can't do anything now.
Steve, oh, I'm going to make you a co-host. And then Fabian, I'm also going to make you a co-host.
Cool, thank you.
I'll give you back your user group.
Thank you.
All right. Are you able to share now, Steve?
I will try. Let's see. It looks like I didn't grant permissions for Zoom to access this. So I have to quit. I'm gonna come back and hopefully this will work. Sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, so
and maybe if you have any questions in the meantime.
Yeah, exactly. And if not, I have some commentary about this.
I may have some questions if you have time. Maybe
yes,
they're not
let's do it.
directly related to what you just said, but is there some way to override the class SFDX command, for example, when you need to, you want an argument to be added on all your custom commands? For the moment, the only way I succeeded to do it is to declare it on each command, but is there some way, some easier way to factorize that?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, I will go back to sharing my screen for a second. Yeah, so we have, this is the data commands. And if I go in plug in data, one of the things you'll see is this. And if you think about the data commands, they all do a lot of the same things. They return output like that's tables, or they write to CSVs, and they have a bunch of shared stuff. So one of the things we did was this, which is to extend SFDX command, right? So a lot of your plugins and even the generator by default will do this, import SFDX command. Okay. But that is just a ES6 class. And so what we did here on, now I lost it. Yeah. So this data command then extends the SFDX command. So for example, we have metrics on how long some of the data commands take that we want it to do. And so there's actually new methods on the command here. This is one where a bunch of flags could say, you could have this flag, or you could have this flag, but you have to have one, but you can't have both, and neither is also not okay. Some of those scenarios. And so like this is now a thing. And so same thing with verifying that a file is there. Rather than having to do this on every single command or try to make a shared function, which is probably how I would have done it originally. But you can kind of see a little bit about what's here. The data commands, most of them also have a -t tooling API flag. And so this lets you use that in one place to say like, okay, give me the connection. And if you say tooling, I get a tooling connection. If you say regular, I get a regular REST API connection. And so then that's the sort of
and is there a method? Is there a method when I can describe all the flags? I didn't see it. Sorry. Because you showed me method, but if I want flags for each command.
Yep. So if I go to, let's go look at like one of the individual commands that worked. So for example, there's bulk API commands. So this is going to extend the data command. And then it then has these flags that it decided are specific to it. But if you want to share flags, you can also import them from like a single place. So let's say I had 5 commands and they all have the same flags. You can pull those in. And if you go to our plugin developer guide, and I'm going to go find flags. So we have this some of the built-in flags kind of live here, but there's a section in here that gives you like how to share flags. Sorry, I can't find it in the developer guide. But yeah, I've done it before in my plugins where what you would say is you would say export, and then the same way that you would create a flag, you would say this object is this, and then you do this, and then what you do is you put this as an export.
You do some object.assign, and it assembles both.
Yeah, and that's a more complex scenario where you might need to modify it. But like, let's say CSV file is used exactly like this, and I want it to have the same message and be required and all that stuff, like across all the commands. I could just import it and say import CSV file from shared flags, right? And then I could use it down here. But yeah, if you have to do like, oh, I need to override or like add things, like some commands require it and some commands don't, then you could leave this property off of it. And then, yeah, you could do what you said, which is I want to import it and then do an object assign, or we actually prefer the little spread operator. So you could spread the flag and then add one property like required or something like that to it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a good question. Steve, are you back?
I'm back, and hopefully this will work now.
Okay,
I just didn't want to pull away I saw you were presenting something, so I didn't want to steal it. Ah, this looks much better. Okay. Now am I sharing something that looks like a slideshow?
Working, yeah, looks good.
Looks good? All right. And Shane, you had the perfect segue, and now I messed it up talking about the unit tests. So like Shane was mentioning, with when you're writing plugins, you can use various unit testing strategies. Like you can use Mocha or Jest directly and go directly to whatever function you want to test. You can use fancy test, which is what Shane showed you, which is an Oak Cliff thing. I think that was written by Jeff Dickey, by the way, who was basically the architect of Oak Cliff, which is, I think it's basically a wrapper around Mocha. And it's also, it gets you a little bit further. Unit testing is very like, test this function and make sure it send it this input, make sure it sends me back or does the right thing, sends me back the right output. And the fancy test stuff is run it through the Oak Cliff framework and mock out a few things and make sure that I get back what I expect. The test kit is much more how a user would execute this. Like I'm typing in a command in the terminal, and it's styled around that. I want to execute this command, maybe pointed to a different SFDX executable and not my bin run, which is what fancy test does. It has, we handle a lot of boilerplate code for you in the test kit. So just defined, it's an NPM library. So if you want to use it, you would have to define it as a dev dependency in your project or in your plugin. It's an NPM library to help Salesforce CLI plugin authors write nuts, which is a great way to ensure your plugin commands work with changes to your plugin and any changes that are made to the CLI itself. But what are nuts? And I think Shane kind of made a reference to this. These are not unit tests. You know, as any software engineer knows, one of the most difficult things to do is naming things. One of the most difficult problems to solve, and this was no different. We wanted this test framework, but we wanted to say that it allows you to do, you know, this kind of testing, but we couldn't say, well, these are smoke tests, or these are integration tests, or these are end-to-end tests. It kind of solves all of that. It can be any of those. So we referred to these as not unit tests. These are nuts, and it's a fun name to say. So this framework allows you to use real orgs, your dev hub, any scratch orgs. It'll create scratch orgs for you if you want. You can use real SFDX projects and not stub everything. And you can point significantly to different versions of the CLI executable, such as the release candidate that we publish every week. If you want to make sure that your plugin works with the soon-to-be released CLI version, you can do that, and you can hook it into your CI to have that ensured. And you can even let us know if we were going to break you. Hopefully we don't. And importantly, it doesn't replace unit tests. This is in addition to unit tests are still important. So why should I use it? Like I said, we take care of a lot of the boilerplate things that you would do, but it gives you two main things. One is a command function for executing your commands, your plugin commands, and then a test session class. Like I said, the top bullet point here, you can verify your plugin commands work with any SFDX executable, including the bin run that comes with your plugin. Or if you do an npm install to a specific version of the CLI, you can use that and just point the test kit to that, the release candidate version, any version you have. What else does exec command give you? You can automatically tell us that we expect this exit code from this command. Usually that would be an exit code 0, meaning it's successful. But you could, if your plugin uses different exit codes, you could say, when I execute this command, it should return a 100, or maybe it's a failure use case. It should fail if I call it this way. Yeah, that's very easy to do. You just pass it along with the exec command call. Automatic JSON parsing and TypeScript typing whenever you execute your command with an appending --JSON. You don't have to, like if we didn't do this for you, you'd have to execute your command, you'd get some kind of a string back, and then you'd have to parse it, and then cast, if you're using TypeScript, you'd have to cast it to whatever type you expect to start working with it. And we handle all of that for you. There's some other nice things about exec command, and we'll look at them a little bit later. And then test session. That is a class that will create a unique directory for all of your testing and test results to happen in, so that we don't pollute your normal CLI environment. Your home directory and where all your auth files live. We don't want to mess that up during testing the plugin. So we create this location that's unique for you, and that's where all of this stuff goes. Easy use of DX projects and orgs. If your plugin requires a project, you can point us to a GitHub URL, and we can clone it into the test session directory and use that, switch the current working directory to that project and use it during testing. If there's a project locally on your machine somewhere, we can copy it into the test session directory and use that. Or maybe your plugin just requires a project and you don't care what the contents of the project are. You can tell us to just generate one for you. Easy DevHub authentication. This is pretty cool. So the test kit will, based on some environment variables, you can tell it, this is my DevHub. This is my DevHub username. The test kit will use your CLI environment to grab that auth file, copy it into a location within the test session directory and use that, and automatically auth to that DevHub. So when your tests start running, you can, for example, create a scratch org, and you don't have to do that yourself, except for just telling us what the DevHub is. There's other auth strategies as well that we can look at a little bit later, but that would be the easiest one. Just tell us what the DevHub is, and we'll handle the authentication for you. An easy way to run setup commands. Let's say your plugin commands require other commands to be run first as part of a setup. I think Shane, actually, you kind of showed this a little bit earlier, where like to run a user command, you need these other things. So let's run these other commands first to set up for these tests to then run. And if any of the setup commands fail, it'll cause your test to fail. You can also inspect the output of those setup commands if you need to refer to them within your tests. Archiving the test session state. So at any point during testing, if your tests fail, maybe you want to see what the state was of anything in your project, or well, anything that lives in this test session directory. You can zip that up and save it off somewhere to inspect later. It's useful when you hook this into CI as well, because sometimes things work beautifully on your local computer, but when you hook it into CI, it fails. You can save that off and then inspect it later and compare states, debug it that way. Allows for parallel testing. So we don't do anything specifically to say run these tests in parallel. That's the testing framework that you want to use. We don't do anything to disallow it. And in fact, when we use this test framework in our own plugins, and we run it all through in parallel, and it speeds things up tremendously. JavaScript test library agnostic, meaning you can use Mocha, you can use Jest, or whatever testing library you would like to use. We don't do anything to force you into a certain library. Only use what you need. You can use as little or as much of the test kit as you want. Like, for example, if you just want simple smoke tests, you can use exec command, and your plugin doesn't need a project or any orgs. You can just use exec command, look for exit code 0, and continue. And it's open source, so you can contribute. You can look at the source code. You can fork it. It's right there for everyone to see. How do I use the test kit? So there are two files that you should look at: the README and the samples that are in our GitHub repo, which I'll show you. I'm not going to go through the whole README, but because there's a little bit of duplication with what I was just saying. But like I said, this is an NPM module, so you would just add it as a dev dependency first and foremost, and look through these docs for all of very detailed samples, and they were, well, I wrote them, so I think they're great, and they're designed so that all you need to do is come here and read and learn about it, and you can easily start using it in your own plugins. There's so there's a link to the samples doc, which I'll show you in a bit. There are links to, so these are our core plugins, core CLI plugins, and these are links to sample nuts that you can look at and see how we're doing it, and to help with your own efforts. I'm not going to go through all of this stuff, but I did want to point out all the environment variables that are used to configure the test kit. Some overrides. You can do setup retries. For example, if you're creating a scratch org, sometimes that fails or it takes too long. You can tell it to retry a number of times. Test kit exec shell, that would be how you'd switch executables. By default, it will just use the bin run that's in a plugin, but let's say you want to use the release candidate. This is how you do that. You'd point it, you'd install it, and then you'd point it to where the executable lives on your machine. And the rest of these are for how the test kit detects the authorization strategy to use to handle that for you. Like I kind of mentioned this one, the hub username. You just give it the username and we'll grab that auth file and use it in your tests. But there are other ways to do this. Switching to the samples. So this is a table of contents kind of broken up by the main features: the exec command function, the test session class, all the environment variables, and a short list of best practices to use when creating these tests. And these are kind of broken out by use cases. So if you think about a use case that you have that you want to write a test for, you just click on one of these links. So for example, testing with setup commands, it takes you to this section. The use case is I have a plugin with commands and tests require other commands to run as part of a setup. And I want to reference the command results within my test. And here's the code that you could use to get you started with that. Your imports, setting up a test session. In this case, it creates just a generated project. You just want to give it a name, my test project. So this is not using a GitHub URL. And you want to run these. You want to create an org, a developer edition org, and you also want to run source push before your actual test runs. You want to clean up, we handle that for you. And that's kind of how these are organized. All of this code, by the way, it's generated and it's compiled. So if the test kit source code is changed, you have to update the sample code as well, particularly if you've broken things. Let's see, there might be a few other key things in here. Actually, let me go back to the top. So exec command can run synchronously, asynchronously. It can look for an exit code, run against a specific CLI executable. We parse the JSON output for you. And also, if you care about the execution time of your commands and you kind of want to put in some checks for that, there's a way to do that. You can, in this example, you're executing this command 3 times and ensuring that it executes in a certain amount of time. We keep track of the command run times and return that for you as part of the exec command call. Let's see some of the other interesting things. Yeah, this is how you would point to a GitHub repo. So in this case, the eBikes LWC, if you wanted to use this for in your testing, this is how you would do it. You just point us to the URL. The test kit takes care of copying that or cloning it into your test session directory and changing your current working directory to that project and using it in your tests. I think there's just a few other things I wanted to point out. Let's see. If you are curious about how the test kit or what specific things the test kit is doing kind of behind the scenes for you, if you want to see that output, you can do it this way by enabling debug on the test kit itself. This goes over various authentication strategies. There are ways, especially when debugging, when you're authoring these tests, you just want to reuse the same project and not have the test recreate things over and over again, especially with Scratch orgs. It can be really time consuming, but you can define overrides so that the test kit doesn't recreate this for you. It'll just use the same test session. It'll use the same project or use the same orgs so that you can more quickly get yourself to the test code itself. I think that's all I had to show. The docs are designed so that just go here and start reading, and hopefully it speaks for itself and you can get yourself up and running really quickly. But yeah, like I said, we use it in our core plugins. We have CI running so that for every CLI release, it executes these tests across all of our core plugins. So it's been hugely useful to us, and hopefully it will be hugely useful to the community outside of Salesforce as well.
So Steve, I'm going to do a quick demo of this and then kind of show what it does in action and look at one of our tests that we had linked to, and then we'll take questions about not unit testing. All right, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
All right, excellent. So I'm going to run all of the not unit tests for the user plugin, and you can see right here that kind of like Steve showed you those environment variables, I'm just going to pass in a hub that's already authenticated on my machine, and I'm going to get this running, and then we'll come back and look at what the test is doing. And so you can see it's going to run everything that ends in nut.ts, and I'm going to run them in parallel. And this plugin, I believe, has 3 nuts running. And so you'll see these 3 test sessions that get created here in the side. And so this is going to keep it from interfering with any of my existing Scratch orgs or auth files. And it also makes it easy to make sure these things get cleaned up. And if we were to open them, you can see that it has gone through and it's got an SFDX folder with orgs in it. It's got the actual project folder, and so does the next one, and so does the next one. They've all got their own auth files and the logs and some of the other stuff that the CLI always puts on here. And you can see as they run. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's happening. So like Steve showed you, I'm importing a couple things from TestKit, the 2 things that he had mentioned. And then I'm also importing types from all of my commands. And the reason I'm doing this is because when I get back the JSON output, I want to be able to refer to the same type that my command is using rather than having to type it again. And so you saw the results that we had earlier. This is an example of using a local project. So if I come to my test directory, I have a whole SFDX project here that we're using, and I needed permission sets and other things in it for testing things you would do with users. And like Steve showed you, I'm running 2 commands. I've got an org create from this project def that's in here, and then I'm pushing this because those permission sets need to be in the org for me to be able to assign them. And you can see our results coming back here. So there have been 3 tests running. And so a little bit about what's going on here. this is an example of getting back typed JSON. So when I run force user display just JSON, I expect it to give me a 0, like I expect this to succeed. And then the JSON output needs to come back and match this type that should match my command. And then as part of my assertion, I don't know what the username is going to be because those are randomly generated, and the org ID, I don't know what it's going to be. But I do know that all those keys need to be there. And if any reason one of those keys was not there, then that would regress all of you, and you would open up GitHub issues and fuss at us on Twitter and stuff. So we are making sure that those things are still there in the output. I expect org IDs to look a certain way, because if we suddenly started returning 15-digit org IDs, that would also mess people up. And so then I also have some expectations about what an access token looks like. And it just goes through all of these. And this one in particular, I like. This is an example of what testing people would call a key flow, because a lot of this stuff has to be done in a certain order. So for example, I'm going to display about the main user, but then when I assign a permission set to that user, I don't have anyone else to assign permission sets to. So I'm going to create another user so that I can then assign a permission set to that secondary user with on behalf of. And you'll see right now, we have a pull request open to assign permission sets, multiple permission sets to multiple users. So like you could pass in a bunch of users here or a bunch of permission sets. And so this test is now modified on that branch to test out that new flow. And so then if I do a user list, I need to see that user that I just created there. And if I do password generation for the primary user and the secondary user, I need to be able to see all those things. And then at the end, I need all of this stuff gone like it never happened. So the scratch org needs to not exist. Do you remember all those files that were over here in the sidebar? Those all get cleaned up as long as I didn't want to keep them. And you'll see my three tests passed and all of their individual things passed. And so this is an example of test kit in action. The other nut is I'm just running these and I'm not even expecting the output. I'm just verifying that they all run successfully. This is like the standard out non-JSON version. And then I had to go over on user create because there's a lot of different flavors of user creation. So for example, this is Fabian's thing for setting unique usernames on something. Well, I wanted to make sure that behaved the way we thought it was going to. But you might put it on the command line, but you might also have like passwords and perm sets assigned at the same time as you're creating the user, where you, instead of passing in the information that you want, you point to like a JSON file that's that user definition. So I wanted to make sure user create ran against that user definition file and stuff like that. So for example, once we're done with all of these, I can do permission set assignments and verify that that permission from that user file actually got assigned. And so here's an example of, oh, I want to execute a command to run a SOCL query against the org to make sure that what's in the org is actually what I sent. So that's an example of how we use nuts for one of the plugins. And then the last thing kind of about testing that I wanted to cover with these is just how we do them in a CI environment. And I think this is really pretty cool. So we do all of our stuff on Circle CI, and you'll see we have some jobs. And so the first thing we're doing is validating the PR meets our conventions and stuff. But then we do all the unit tests, and you'll see we're testing on Linux and Windows across a few different NPM releases. So these are just running all the unit tests in certain combinations. And then as long as those pass, you'll see test package passed. Then we run the nuts, and we get to run these on both Linux and Windows. So full integration tests on real hubs and real orgs with real commands on 2 different platforms, which is pretty cool. Because I think we only have one person on the team with a Windows machine, right? So that's really useful. We also have this other test that is a really bizarre little test. It runs nightly and verifies that everything would build correctly on the next version of TypeScript. So that if we wrote something that totally works today, totally compiles, but it's going to prevent us from bumping to the next TypeScript release, we would like to know sooner rather than later. And then we have this little thing called Just Nuts, which is probably one of the most creative solutions I've seen to improving the stability of the CLI. After we do a release, we have a job on our main repo that runs the nuts on all of the plugins. So the ones that Steve showed you, there's org and alias, they all run their unit tests with the new version of the CLI. So just in case we change something in the CLI that affects one of the plugins, we verify that all of the nuts run correctly on all the platforms that we care about, and that nothing behaves badly. And so that's the when Steve was talking about SFDX executable path, we're normally running this little bin run command. It's the same as if you said /bin/run and then put in force org create or something. But on the CLI command, we're saying, no, don't use the one from this plugin, use the one from the actual CLI to run all your tests. And so that gives us a little bit more certainty that we are not messing things up. And this is all fairly recent. This is all work that's been done this year to improve stability of releases and sort of keep all these plugins happily working together and know when we have a problem before it gets out to you. So that's been one of our big initiatives for the year. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and take questions about not unit testing.
I have some again, sorry.
Yeah, great.
So thanks for the great presentation, and for my own work, I already have 2 SFDX plugins for various reasons, and there is something I noticed. I think that it's about documentation, because the Oak-Cliff way to generate documentation, for me, it makes some, and I think not just for me, it makes the documentation really hard to handle, because you have, for example, on your plugin, you have dozens of commands with all the arguments. So for example, I discovered on your plugin a great command to generate permission sets from profiles, but I already looked numerous times at your plugin, but I didn't see it because in the documentation, in my opinion, if you want a plugin to be easily usable by the newbies or less expert people, we need something more visual, or do you see what I mean? Is there some way to maybe, if I already hide the ID, for example, generate some MKDocs online documentation, because we could call requires SFDX project arguments, etc. I think we have all the data to generate great documentation just from the code, but the only way today we use it is to generate too verbose and complicated documentation. So is there some plan to standardize some way to automatically generate user-friendly documentation?
There is not. We have I would say we've been using Oak-Cliff and trying really hard to use Oak-Cliff pretty much as it exists. And so I agree with you that that giant README file on for mine, I end up going to it and Control-Fing to try to find words that I'm looking for. So yes, I agree. I think what you described is it's really hard to know if a plugin does something until you install the plugin, because the -- help is pretty good. Once you're at the CLI, once it's installed. But yeah, the README files are harder because they're so huge. I think the links look really ugly because it has all the parameters and the links. So yeah, that is, those are probably changes that would be better if we made them in Oak-Cliff itself, because Oak-Cliff has that little document generator thing. So if you or I got into the mood to fix that, I think it would be better to fix it in Oak-Cliff.
I was thinking about that. Maybe some of these weekends, but I have a lot of work. But I really think that we could, with Node, just read all the commands. Basically, what Oak-Cliff does, but generate, for example, something in docs folder, and then use MKDocs to generate navigation, etc. And it could be easily hosted on GitHub pages. I think it could be great. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Even if you had a file for each plugin,
yep,
that sort of contained its help output or something easier to read, and then maybe like Steve did, maybe at the top you have like, here's the short summary list, and then you could click and go down to like the details for each one. Yeah, I agree. It could be a lot better.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah.
Is there any other question?
Let me see, I've got some other.
Oh, there is just one wonderful joke, but besides that,
yeah, we've had a number of jokes, and as we've come up with new things that relate to the nuts, like the naming puns just become irresistible. All right, I have a question from John Daniel that I'll take. What is the latest thinking about the CLI will start to use the REST API again to handle the interactions of Salesforce versus SOAP? Can I punt that one to you, Steve, since you're working on source library stuff?
You can punt it to me.
Okay.
Good question, John. What can I say here? Are you asking when it's going to be the default? Because you can use it, right? Like,
yeah. So what
I bet.
what I'm talking about is the story that I'm hearing is that we switched to REST API. There was a lot of problems, a lot of regression issues. I'm hearing that the regression issues were not actually with the CLI, but rather with the REST API in general against the Salesforce environment. So what I'm curious about is what's the thinking as far as when we're gonna those regression bugs will be cleaned up? When will the CLI start to move back in the direction that time? And of course, it's all safe harbor and everything. I'm just more curious than anything.
Yeah. So it was a combination of server side issues and CLI issues. Without talking too much about our org chart internally, the CLI team doesn't manage everything that's CLI. Sometimes we delegate that stuff out to other teams who are more subject matter experts, I'd say, in this area. So we've made some things better with the REST API. I don't think they're all fixed. I don't know what that team's priorities are and how soon they're going to fix this stuff so that we can just switch over and use it. So yeah, this is a horrible answer, but I really don't know when that's gonna happen. Keep writing bugs and keep writing issues, and we'll pass them along, and what we can fix, what the CLI team can fix. But for the server side stuff, that goes to a different team. And I know that's a horrible answer, but
I'll give an even worse answer. I think the REST SOAP bugs are a good use case for the nuts. And so as we write all of the different possible things that you might push and pull and retrieve and deploy and all that kind of stuff, it is really easy for us to flip the REST to SOAP thing as part of these nuts and run them all both ways. And you would almost think of it like an Apex hammer, where you would say, hey, if all of these work equally well on both scenarios and all of these fail equally well on both scenarios, then we would feel pretty confident turning that thing on. And I would say our lack of integration test when that defect happened was probably a big part of how that happened and kind of went on as long as it did. And so I think, we could make that switch once the test results say that we can make that switch. And once we feel pretty good about it. The other thing I would say about that one in particular is that some of the problems we were having were the API wasn't returning JSON, which is sort of unheard of. We would get back like a GAC, but in like HTML into it. We're trying to parse JSON that's not JSON. And we weren't expecting that. We hadn't had that experience with some of our other APIs. And so there's some stuff on the CLI side, and actually some stuff in JSForce that we could make that a little bit better as far as catching that and at least surfacing something better to the user, maybe a smarter retry, because what we saw with those errors is they were very intermittent. It was dependent on like what source you were deploying. Sometimes it would pass and then it would fail. They were like, sometimes the API was just behaving badly. So I think there's some options there, but I would say there is still the option to use it if you want to use it. So if you find some source that it works really great for and you don't see API issues, then feel free to switch back to using it. Yeah, we wish we'd had test kit at the time.
Yeah, it may be a stupid question, but moving to REST API, I mean, from SOAP, is it just to get things faster? Or?
Yeah, there's some performance stuff. I think the biggest driver for customers in terms of like what's better there is that there's a much larger payload limit in terms of the amount of metadata that you can deploy with REST is much higher than it is with SOAP. And so we have some really large organizations that have to break up metadata deploys into several steps. And the idea is that if that were working really well, you would be able to deploy larger deployments in one transaction with REST.
Okay, so is it like the size of the payload or also the number of metadata items?
Both.
Both, okay, cool.
That's been an ask for a long time, and I don't think the SOAP API was going to support it. So that's why the REST one we thought would be really nice.
Okay. Any other question? Don't be shy.
I have another question. I think here are open source contributors, and how or what kind of should we use for our open source projects? Because like for now, I'm creating a trial DevOps every month to have a bigger limit, like with 40 scratch jobs per day, to handle all the pull requests and CI runs. Is there anything that we can expect to get like as open source people?
That's a good idea. That's a good question. Yeah, right now dev hubs are very much tied to like normal Salesforce licensing things. But I have a meeting a little bit later today, completely coincidental, with the person that runs some of our open source programs. But yeah, that's a thing that we should probably consider, is if you're trying to do tests on real orgs and scratch orgs and automate unit testing and stuff like that, the regular developer edition is probably not, it's going to be a challenge, to run 5 scratch orgs in parallel, if you're trying to test across platforms like we are and stuff. Yeah, I don't have an answer to that because, unfortunately, CLI team is not in charge of scratch orgs or licensing. But yeah, I'm gonna write that down for when I talk to Terrence.
Because I got the same issue yesterday, and it's I think the worst limit is about not the number of scratch orgs that you can have at the same time, but the number that you can create in one day. So it's 6. So even if it's like only 3 active scratch orgs at the same time, it's okay because you can delete them as soon as it's finished. But creating 6 a day is just you can't test anything.
Yeah, I posted a link to an idea on a Trailblazer community. So if you can take that into your meeting.
Okay, yeah, let me grab that.
Cool.
Thank you. Yeah, we've had some discussions internally about, what nice things could we do for open source contributors that are trying to, that are doing a lot of helpful stuff for us too. And that I have not thought about just, hey, let's give you more scratch orgs so you can test your projects better. But that'd be a really good one.
There are a few comments about Nicolas. Nicolas, maybe you want to.
No, maybe it's not so fascinating for everyone, but maybe I think it's more a Oak Cliff problem. But Shane and Steve, did you notice that when you call a plugin command, it seems that all the pre-hooks and the post-hooks of all other plugins are called also?
Steve, you want to take that? You know about that.
Well, I'm no hook expert, but I can just knowing that it's just an event that's fired. So whatever's listening to it, it's going to handle it. You can probably put some kind of short circuit logic inside the handler to do nothing or very
on
little.
my handlers, I do that, but I think all the other plugins don't do it, and I think it takes a lot of time. So I think it is in the way plugins are linked to SFDX CLI. Maybe there would be some way to say that when you call a command, call the hooks only of these commands and not the hooks of all plugins inside. But just a suggestion.
Yeah, that's interesting. We can pass that along.
We could at least encourage plugin authors to be really considerate with their use of hooks and, quickly give up on something that's not what they're looking for.
I also have a question about hooks. So maybe if you're not hooks expert, maybe Nicolas will know.
I am. Tell me.
One thing that is painful, I was able to do it, but what's painful, you don't have all the context that you usually have with regular commands. So you need to find like which current user you're using, for instance. You can get the target username quite easily. Maybe I missed something.
I think what you want to do, the hooks, it's before you call the command, and I think before you identify the org, the user, the DevOps, the project, etc. I think in the hooks, you just have in options.command, you have the arguments that are called on the CLI. But I think if you want to do something with stuff that you can find only on SFDX command class, you have to do it directly at the beginning of the command call, and you probably can't do it in the hooks.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I was able to find the username, but then I need to find the connection from this username. Well, it's a little bit more painful. I was wondering if I was missing something, but maybe not.
I tried it, but I gave up and put it stuff like that in the beginning of each command.
Okay, thank you. I think we are pretty good because it's 2 minutes over the official end time, so that's quite. We are pretty good, I think, given that we started with 5 minutes late. So we are pretty good at time. So if there is no other question, I think it's time to thanks again Shane and Steve for the presentation, because I think it's very, very interesting and not covered a lot on either blog post or whatever. So it was really great to have you with us tonight. So thank you again.
Yes, thanks again. It was a great presentation.
Thanks for having us, and
thank you.
Glad to share with you. All right, bye, y'all.
Cool. Thank you very much. Bye. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.